Well, one of the biggest issues of our time is the evolving understanding that people have of law enforcement, usually precipitated by amateur or body camera footage. These factors have been opening a lot of eyes of people in the white community who have lent a largely deaf ear on complaints of minority communities about police misconduct. This issue has involved a lot of conflict with NFL players kneeling, two presidents now angering various people with their comments. So the Black Lives Matter movement, your personal experience of this with, you represented Edmund Ovasapian, a man accused of murder by the Glendale Police Department, who the department knew did not commit the crime. I mean, you ended up suing the department and getting your client a settlement, north of $1 million. Well, tell us the story and tell us what it shows that people need to understand about police and police power.
Well, I'll tell you very quickly a story of what's going on in Los Angeles, because I think it shows you why the Black Lives Matter movement is so angry and so powerful. And it has to do with a young man, an African-American man in Venice, California, who was about 30 years old, and he was shot by a police officer on the street after supposedly a struggle. And it was a fascinating case for civil rights attorneys, because for the first time you had his partner didn't back up his story. The videotape didn't back up his story. The police commission actually stated that the shooting was outside of policy. And then fourth, and the only time in my career I've ever heard this, the LAPD, the chief of police, stated that his own officer ought to be prosecuted. It was amazing. 2 years later, which is now 2 weeks ago, the district attorney, Jackie Lacey, came out and said, we're not going to prosecute. You sit there and think, how in the world is it possible that you've got all this and you still say you can't make a case, or you still say that it's too tough of a case? I actually started a petition along with some other civil rights attorneys to have her removed, to recall her or to ask her to resign, because that's just outrageous. And it really is incredible, and you understand why Black Lives Matter gets so frustrated at the system, and that whites don't grasp what's going on in the community when something like that can happen, and even their own chief of police tells them they ought to be prosecuted, and they're not. That, to me, in fact, I just was talking about it at this Our Revolution. I said, people criticize Black Lives Matter. About 50% of the Democratic Party won't even utter the phrase. They won't utter it, which I find amazing to me, because the greatest constituent for the Democratic Party has always been African Americans, especially female African Americans. And yet, when the time comes to stand up for them, the Democratic Party, about half the party, is too much cowards to stand up and support them. There are reasons that they're marching. There are reasons they're upset. This isn't just something they're making up. It's prevalent in the community. So I strongly support the movement. I strongly support what they're doing, because I've seen it. They're not asking. This is where I had somebody come to me the night and say, my son's a police officer and Blue Lives Matter. They're not saying that police officers are all terrible or awful, or that we need to remove police from the streets, or as somebody actually suggested today, we need to get rid of police departments. That's not what we need to do. I mean, no one really thinks that. They just want to see police officers engage in additional de-escalation training, so that when they show up for a situation, the first thing isn't to draw their gun. The first thing is to actually try and de-escalate the situation.
Well, here in Chico and Butte County, they're beginning to experiment with embedding with embedding social workers in with the police when they go to make some of these calls. So if somebody is mentally ill and they're in some degree of distress, they'll have a professional there to help try to de-escalate it, because it is kind of a lot to expect a police officer to be able to have that level of training with all the other training that he or she needs to do. Your average police officer, to expect that person as well to have the skill as a social worker to understand it is kind of a lot. So is that a good idea, do you think, to have that kind
I think it's a great idea. Yeah. I absolutely support it. My experience is this. My experience that most police officers, when faced with a difficult situation, respond the way pretty much anyone would. We all are humans. You know, you may have training, you may be totally trained in a situation, but somebody's pointing a gun or what you see as a gun, you react because we all have a survival instinct.
Right.
You react. What I have a problem with, I had a case that was a perfect example of it where a young Asian man had he was carrying a steel rod down by his side, and apparently he had knocked out a car window as he was walking. And it probably, I'm guessing, that we didn't get medical reports, but he was probably high on something. And he was walking down the street, and he went to kind of a mall area, and the police showed up, and they started pointing guns at him, told him to drop the thing, and he kind of looked at him, and then turned away in a different direction and walked off. And he had the steel rod down by his side. The problem I had with that and how they handled it, I can understand you want to keep the public safe. But a police officer ran in front of him, got in front of him with a gun, told him, stop, drop it. And when the guy took 2 steps forward, he shot him and killed him. The police officer was creating the situation.
Conflict.
Yes. And the training, as we proved in court, the training would have been totally different if the police officer if they'd handled it differently and they allowed him to keep walking, and they would have followed behind and watched what he was doing and so forth. That's what I think most of us, especially most of us who do civil rights law, we just want to make sure that the police officers are doing everything they can to prevent having to shoot first and ask questions later.
And I mean, how would you respond to people that say that there are institutional pressures for the police department, for instance,
sure.
that there are, that there needs to be, I don't want to use the term a free hand, but that they need to have some discretion to not only handle these incidents, but also afterwards to say, well, this is kind of our system, and we need to play it out in our own systems. In other words, that they need to have a little bit less light shown on them, that their system will break down a little bit if too much attention is focused on policing. Is that a fair argument they're making?
There is a fine line here, and I often see it in my practice, and that is sometimes people want to say every time a police officer shoots, especially somebody who's unarmed, they're wrong. The police officer's automatically wrong. That's not the case. There are cases where police officers shoot, and even in circumstances where a person may be unarmed, and there are legitimate reasons for it. And we have to acknowledge that, and we have to understand that every shooting is not a misconduct. Okay, but you can, as a lawyer and even as a juror, you can differentiate between someone who is making a decision based on reason. I mean, we use a standard, what would a reasonable police officer do, versus someone who just is so far out of policy and is so far is doing it absolutely wrong. We can make those distinctions. And what I tell people is, please understand, when a police officer does something that they're absolutely not supposed to do, and they shoot somebody and kill them, you're not talking about charging them with first-degree murder or second-degree murder or even voluntary manslaughter. You're talking about manslaughter, which is the same thing you would be charged with if you were driving down the street and you accidentally ran over somebody. You did the wrong thing, okay? And you need to be penalized for taking somebody's life outside of what you were supposed to do. That's what we're talking about with police officers, okay? When they go way outside of the procedure. But I think there's no question. We have to give them some leeway. There's no question about that. They have to be allowed to do their jobs. Not every shooting is a bad shooting.